We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. And today we have with us Darrick Hamilton, who's the Henry Cohn Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School, and also the founding director of the Institute for Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. So thanks for joining us, Darrick.
Thank you, Dean. It is an honor, a privilege, and great respect for you for all that you've been doing for all these years. I have learned a great deal from you, and would be proud to call myself a colleague and friend of yours, especially in this fight to bring about an economics, a political economy frame that's really aimed at living up to the values of promoting the well-being of everyone.
Well, thanks, Darrick. That's very nice of you, and I certainly feel the same way, which is why I'm very happy to have you on here. So I guess I'll start with the big, awful question that we have to ask. We're seeing kind of, I'm trying to think of a better word, but I'm just going to say shitstorm being thrown at us. I should think of a better word, but the Trump administration is hitting us with one thing after another. He seems intent on turning back whatever racial progress, just about any progress, maybe we should say, we've made as a country in the last half century. What's the story here? Can we hope for a turnaround? Can we see any brightness on the horizon? I keep looking. Maybe you could tell me something I haven't seen.
Perhaps the brightness is Trump is indicative in this administration of a shift in paradigms, a shift from a paradigm that has framed our political economy over the last 40, 50 years or so. And a good way to think of Donald Trump is a symptom of that bipartisan economy that's been lifted up by both Democrats and Republicans that's left us vulnerable to a strong man like Donald Trump, someone who's using authoritarian strongman type politics aimed at promoting the politics of division. So because of the conditions that we have arisen to, we have been left vulnerable to somebody who is able to find particular constituents and offer them as a trade-off for their political loyalty, relative status. So the concept of relative status understood as being a trade-off between absolute status. You can imagine that humans place themselves in view their well-being both in absolute context, but also in relative context. And what Donald Trump is clearly offering his constituents is relative status using the politics of division. So, I've defined his playbook, but let me get to potentially the optimism, which is we went the way of Donald Trump, but we were also at a juxtaposition where we could have gone another way. We could have promoted a new political economy aimed at really centering all people as well as the environment that we live in. When we see right now, there was a recent earthquake, and we have the threat of tsunamis taking place and many other climate catastrophes. So I know I'm being long-winded, but the optimism is that society is ready for change. And what we have had and what has precipitated Donald Trump is an economy that's led to mass vulnerability and insecurity.
Yeah, I think picking up on that, I mean, the desire for change. I mean, not that I'm a political science expert, but it's hard to miss. I mean, a lot of people, people I've talked to, not that I go around surveying everyone, but, you talk to people on the street, you meet people, you bump into them. There are people that, I came across that voted for Trump just because they said, well, we need to change. And like, well, I'm not sure that's a change we need, but that wasn't, that wasn't what they're, we weren't going in depth. It was just, we need a change. And, you had a lot of people that felt discontent, and, a lot of good reasons, the data as well as I do. There's a lot of good reasons for, most people having felt discontent. And, so you had people vote for change, and better or worse, a lot of them want the change that he's doing, but a lot of people that voted for him didn't, they felt the need for change. that wasn't necessarily what they wanted. So
Yeah.
I guess that's, what we could see as, one possible cause for optimism.
Yeah. And he clearly didn't have a mandate. I mean, a great many of people still don't even vote. And it wasn't like he won by a landslide, but he was able to put together enough of a base by offering them, again, relative status aimed at the politics of division that they ultimately voted for. And then more optimism, if we want to have more optimism. Not too long ago, we faced the pandemic recession, which was a pretty deep recession. We had unemployment levels that surpassed the Great Recession. And from my estimation, it is remarkable that we're not still in a deep recession. So I guess some optimism was the ways in which we managed that pandemic recession were very different than that of the Great Recession. Some of the things we did was we put moratoriums on evictions. We sent cash directly to the American people. We put moratoriums on foreclosures. I mean, we essentially put together an economic rights package for those people that were already employed. We told employers if they maintained payroll, they would get a forgivable loan. So we did all the things that I believe we should be doing in order to invest in the American people. And the results from that recession was the shortest recession on record. Again, I think it's pretty remarkable that we have surpassed levels of unemployment, levels of productivity than when we entered that pandemic recession. So we have a blueprint. And another big question was, why did government intervene in a different way during this pandemic recession than they did during the Great Recession? And there, I believe, is the result of people taking to the streets, movements like the Me Too movement, movements like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. They led to a groundswell of political activism that led to interventions that were very different this time around. And we didn't end up with the oxymoronic jobless recovery, which quite frankly led to the inequities and the vulnerabilities that ultimately precipitated fascist and authoritarian type tactics that Trump is employing.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, it's important to remind us of these, remind me at least, but, of this recent history, because, we did have a great recovery, no two ways about it. And for, I don't know, whatever we want to date it, 18 months or so, we had something like social democracy. We were sending checks to people. We were, people were unemployed, originally it was $600 a week supplements, and then it was lowered to $400, I believe, or $300, I forget whichever, but still a big supplement to unemployment checks, particularly for a lower wage earner. As you said, the eviction moratorium, the foreclosure moratorium, we extended healthcare coverage to millions of people. So we had more people covered for healthcare, during that period, during this recession, 2020, 2021, than we did either before or today, even before whatever cuts we see coming from, the Trump administration's big beautiful bill. So we actually did a lot of really good things there, and that is important. And again, the contrast, you and I both lived through that, the recovery from the Great Recession, and we were pulling our hair out. We're going, why can't you? It wasn't a secret. You need to spend more money. You need to. We should have more. We could give the whole list of things. More infrastructure is an obvious thing, but more healthcare, more a whole range of things that we could have usefully done during that period. And instead, we had this very slow recovery, and we didn't get to below 5% unemployment until I forget it was 2016 or 2017. And recession starts in 2008. So that was a really slow, long recovery. And naturally, people were bitter about it because, again, we immediately rescued the banks. It was just, and again, I was involved with people, and I understand the argument. It's not that there wasn't an argument, but they were lying. I mean, we had people saying, "Oh, if we don't do that, we'll have the Great Depression, the Second Great Depression." I'm going, how? How? I mean, the one thing, I've always appreciated in economics. I was reading Keynes before I took any economics. That was weird. I mean, that's why I did take economics. But, we know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. So it was just incredibly frustrating to me. Make an honest argument for why you want to bail out the banks. Don't say we're going to have a second Great Depression. That's just absurd. And, again, you could argue it. I think it was the wrong thing to do, at least without conditions, which is largely what we did. But, understandably, that promoted, whether we want to call it fascist, but a lot of the sort of sentiments that put Donald Trump in power. And, again, the point you made about the voting, we should be very clear because Trump, buys, just be straight here, talks about his great mandate. He didn't get a majority of the people voting. So I'm not even talking about, as you correctly point out, somewhere around a third of the population doesn't vote. But of the people voting, he didn't get a majority. And in fact, his margin over Kamala Harris was less than Hillary Clinton's margin over him in 2016. Now, he won. I can't deny that. That's the reality. He got more votes than she did. He won the Electoral College. That's both true. But you can't say that was some huge mandate with, everyone turning out saying they want to vote for Donald Trump. That just was not the story. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling,
No, all good. These are spot on. I would, again, look at those two different recessions and interventions, and you get a tale of two recoveries. And we would be naive to not understand how economic interventions link to politics, and understanding that lesson of how people are left vulnerable for the manner of interventions, and then how that can lead to authoritarianism, gives us some good lessons how we can do things differently, as well as the interventions that took place during the pandemic. Now, we know that that inflation stole the story, and there are lots of explanations beyond government intervention that also led to the high levels of inflation: profiteering, the abuse of power in order to extract higher prices. We know some of that, a good amount of that took place. But even if you add inflation to the story, we're a little myopic as to where we were and where we are now, and how those interventions were effective. I'll add another point to the story, which is government didn't just make this about face in the types of interventions that were different during the pandemic versus the Great Recession. I would say that the Great Recession type interventions was the common sense of our era, and is the common sense of our era. You and I reject that common sense. But another big lesson is people made government reject that common sense and do something different. It was political power that led to, and the Biden administration should get credit for the interventions they put forth. Administrations get credit, good or bad. But I think the lesson to take away is, if we want something different, we need political mobilization to make them do something different. And then, Dean, I'll get this last point in. We mentioned economics, we mentioned politics, and then here's the other point: identity stratification, identity group stratification. So in this current iteration, it is the use of some subaltern group, whether it is foreign-born individuals residing in the U.S., whether it is Black individuals, whether it is women. It is the exploitation of somebody's group identity by which Trump is able to offer, in a transactional way, relative status for their political loyalty, which allows him to pass a tax cut that is essentially a big transfer of our public resource towards the wealthy and corporate sector. And then, because it's not as if these other cuts that he puts forth, like Medicaid, are actually going to pay for the tax cuts that are going to take place over the next 10 years. And neither one of us are deficit hawks. But nonetheless, in a mean-spirited way, there is also this extraction from poor and working class individual by taking away their health care under the guise of a rhetoric of waste, fraud, and abuse. Under the guise of a rhetoric, this all fits into a political economy, a common sense that blames the inequality and poverty that we see today on undeserving uh, deficit people who have the wrong attitudes and behaviors when that is the furthest thing from the truth. The reality is poverty and inequality in America is the result of resource deprivation. Resource deprivation. And we saw that when the pandemic interventions took place and that resource deprivation was addressed, not only did it improve lives in the first instance, it led to positive macroeconomic multipliers as well as externalities that benefited us all.
Yeah, again, the data. When we get to, I understand most people don't want to hear detailed discussions of the data, but we could give these, and we should talk about the general pictures. But the data is very clear in this. It's not as though we're weaving stories. I know Trump will weave stories, but I mean, these are stories that are based on data, and again and again and again, when you try to do serious analysis, we were talking a moment ago about, throwing people off Medicaid, and their line is, oh, well, if you want to get health care, you should work. You go, well, just about everyone who's on Medicaid who, isn't caring for young kids, isn't disabled, they are working, so this idea that you have this large population. And, we could ask them, what's the color of the people you're thinking of? I mean, they don't say that, but, this is a long, tradition. It isn't new. They're thinking, obviously, lazy Black and brown people. And, they're getting their Medicaid. I mean, a little bit of it's crazy that, you're living off your Medicaid. These are payments that go to a doctor, they go to a hospital. How are you living off that? I mean, people are happy to have it, of course, but it's utterly absurd. That's why you're not working. But, obviously there's a long tradition of this. And, I remember Reagan, he did this, he'd go around 1980 and he'd talk about someone goes to the grocery store and they're paying with food stamps. He describes a strapping young buck who has his food cart full of steaks. And there's the woman behind him trying to, pay for her family, and she can't afford steaks, and and he's paying for it in food stamps. Now, it's obviously an absurd story because you wouldn't be getting a lot of steaks with your food stamps. But the other thing, again, strapping young buck. Again, what color is the strapping young? And so I have to say, Reagan would feel some need to try to conceal his racism to some extent, but dog whistle is probably the best term. Trump less so. But yeah, that's clearly, it's this very mean spirit and, really just open appeals to racism. And unfortunately, that does have resonance.
Yeah. And let's go back to that phrase, waste, fraud, and abuse. And as you accurately always do, let's look at the accountability of the words we put forth. So what are the mechanisms to so-called redress waste, fraud, and abuse? They try to mar people down with bureaucracy. So whether you're working or not, they're anticipating and counting on people being disillusioned to get even the benefits that they are allocated by paperwork, by bureaucracy. And let's add some hypocrisy to what it is that they're putting forth. Again, this tax bill in its totality, or reconciliation bill, budget reconciliation bill in its totality, involves a diversion of our public resource towards the wealthy and corporate class of our society. Well, let's look at IRS's mechanisms of addressing waste, fraud, and abuse. The entity that's most likely to be audited? Those working poor individuals who received earned income tax credit benefits. And even amongst that group of EITC earners, in addition to being most likely to be audited, it is Black people at every level of the income distribution that is more likely to be audited than a white individual. And I know the IRS has algorithms that are supposed to be colorblind, and I put that in quotes because we know our AI technology in and of itself, if not properly redressed, will only amplify the bigotry that's already built into our systems. So if there was an authentic concern about waste, fraud, and abuse, and we look at our tax code, which is our biggest fiscal tool, why are we diverting so much resources going after, frankly, not a whole lot of money, when in fact the wealthy class, where it could be more dire consequences, less resources are going towards actually trying to redress waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, that really is an incredible story. And again, in case people don't know the numbers, I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertip, but the maximum earned income tax credit's probably around 8,000. Would you happen to know that offhand? It's not a lot of money in the scheme of things. I mean, obviously, it's a lot of money for the people who are getting it, but we're talking about our budget. That's not a lot of money. And that's a maximum. Most people get the earned income tax credit are getting 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. So again, it means a lot to them. It's a big deal to them, but it's not a lot of money. Whereas when you look at the top 1%, these are people, and again, I don't have the latest data at my fingertips, but I'm sure it hasn't changed much. The estimates, this is from the Congressional Budget Office, of the tax loss from people actually owing taxes that they're not paying is around $600 billion a year. And that's overwhelmingly the top 1%, not entirely, because, you do have some people cheat on their taxes, more middle income people. So it's not all the top 1%, but that's where most of it is. So you go, okay, we're going to be auditing people who are getting 3,000 or 4,000 for the earned income tax credit. Here you have someone who, they report an income of $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. It's virtually a guaranteed thing that there's something on their tax code, their tax forms, where they owe another 10, 20,000. In some cases, if they're a big time fraud, they might owe hundreds of thousands. And we've deliberately, and again, this is a conscious decision of the Trump administration, Republicans more generally, they've cut back the enforcement hugely so that if you did, if you felt like not paying your taxes, and you're, most of us, it's deducted from our paycheck, so we don't have much choice. But, if you're, some really high income person gets money from, owning stock and owning a company or whatever, and you feel like cheating on your taxes, there's very little likelihood you'll get caught because, there's no one there at the IRS who's policing that at this point. So it really, again, fine to go after waste, fraud, and abuse, but it doesn't make sense. We're trying to reduce the money that we're going out wrongly or not collecting that we should be. It's not the person getting the earned income tax credit that's, 3,000 a year, 4,000 a year. It's, these high-end people.
Yeah, it reeks of being disingenuous. That's the problem. So, and I guess another lesson from the pandemic recession, as we talk a little bit about our tax code, is that the tax code goes well beyond revenue collection. The tax code, when we think about a tax cut versus a tax rebate, the implications on a federal budget is essentially the same. So, the rhetoric and the understanding, even when we use the phrase taxpayers' money, I find that a bit problematic because what is implied is those people with a federal tax liability, because we all face tax liabilities, but those people with the federal tax liabilities are somehow more deserving than the rest of us. When in fact, our tax code is industrial policy. Our tax code is the strategic decision of government to make decisions on what sectors of the economy should receive resources and not. And, again, I think the lessons from that pandemic recession, and in general, let's forget about the pandemic recession. If we believe the purpose of the economy should be to facilitate people to be their best selves, should be to promote self-determination, should be able to promote tranquility. We talk about crime and all these other things. If you want stability, if you want tranquility, well-resourced individuals promote tranquility. I'll add another one, Dean, that I think is a bit of a flip in the ways in which we think about the economic workings of our society and what we actually should be doing. A lot of the narratives around deficit individuals and people resort to fertility and family formation, as if certain groups of individuals are making irresponsible decisions as it relates to who they love, how they love, and their choices in child producing and child rearing. We should perhaps even flip that relationship. Shouldn't a purpose of an economy be able to facilitate people to have the basic human attribute of love itself? Shouldn't we be trying to figure out how to forge well-resourced individuals so that they can have stable relationships of their choice and the human right to reproduce the way they want to reproduce? I think we need to understand and flip this relationship and understand that the main reason for families to dissolve or the main reasons why you end up with uh, perhaps even dysfunctional, I shouldn't even use that word, or families that are not the most healthy scenario is resourced. These are under-resourced families and individuals. So if you want stable families, not for its functional value, for its value in and of itself, then we need to be promoting policies like EITC, or go a step further. The right to a job itself and the right to an income itself by way of the tax code, particularly with income. And we could say a whole lot more about that. And I'm gonna land this plane in this statement to just say that we need to think about people not as costs on our government, but we should think about people are the point of our economy, and we need to have programs and policies aimed at investing in people that will not only benefit them, but will promote tranquil, healthy, stable environments and avoid the vulnerability to somebody like Donald Trump, who comes in and ratchets up the federal budget towards police enforcement of ICE, where we're witnessing with TikTok and in live time, people going to courthouses and being basically snatched away and diverted to places that they're unfamiliar with. I can't imagine that that's a society that most of us would want to live in.
Yeah, no, these are very good points. And, again, starting with the, with the point you were making before about how we think about, making, what's the purpose of the economy, how we should make people whole, make their lives whole. And again, hate to be, data nerd, but, again, we measure things. I mean, these are secondary factors in the sense we care about people's well-being, but, you look at the rate of, divorce, family breakup. You look at various issues, progress, in learning for early childhood. We know that having stable economic situation makes a huge difference. And, we're seeing a lot of good things that way in the pandemic recovery, because again, we're giving people money, we're giving people health care. They couldn't be foreclosed, they couldn't be evicted. It meant a huge deal to people in terms of a stable situation. And of course, we could look at other countries where they do this better. I mean, no one's perfect, but, we could look at, many countries in Europe, they do this a lot better in terms of, providing security for families. And we really should be making that a priority. So again, you go, okay, let's, not that they're necessarily in conflict, but let's say, okay, the economy were to grow 0.5% more rapidly over the next decade. But let's say an alternative scenario, we made sure that, families could have kids and be stable in the sense that they're not worried about being evicted. They're not worried about losing their income, losing their job. It would be hard for me to say with a straight face, oh, we need that 0.5% more growth. Again, other things equal, sure, 0.5% more growth, fine. I mean, what's it going for? We want to know that. But, yeah, generally, I'm going to say more growth is probably better. But, again, if it's at the cost, if somehow we're saying that, oh, that means we can't have stable families, we can't ensure that people could raise their kids in, a modicum of comfort, it isn't worth that. And again, I'm not convinced there's generally those trade-offs. But if that were the trade-off, I would say fine.
Yeah, because again, what is the point? But I agree with you. It's not clear that, in fact, there would be less growth. One could obviously come up with an argument that there would be more growth. And as you correctly stated, what is the point of this in the first place? Growth should be the secondary condition. The primary condition is people. And of course, we need growth to help sustain a population. But let's not lose our eyes on the prize and what the point and purpose of this is in the first place.
Yeah. So let me raise a specific policy that you've been probably more associated with than anyone. Certainly, if you ask me who talked about baby bonds, you're the top of my list. So, you've been pushing this for a long time. And, I think it's a very good, useful proposal. We kind of got something like that. So let me ask you about what Congress ended up pushing through. You could go into, as much detail as you want there, and how that relates to, the proposal you've been putting on the table for, I don't know, two or three decades now.
So included in this reconciliation package was what Donald Trump and the Republican Party are labeling Trump accounts. And the accounts provide the provision of $1,000 at birth for a cohort of 2 years of babies born. And I forget when it exactly starts. I believe it's 2026, but I'm not positive. But for 2 years, they'll seed every child born with an account of $1,000. So at face value, that seems like a good policy. And its intent is to, when the child becomes a young adult, so uh, they're managed in the private sector. So these aren't governmentally managed accounts. They're intended to be used towards generally wealth promoting activities like a down payment on a home, like some capability to start a business, like the ability to finance education. And then they also have in this version the ability to use cash. So let's level set. The stakeholder part of everybody getting $1,000 at birth is a great idea. It is not new to the American framing, and it politically is just that, a stakeholder society, everybody involved. But if we want to understand how wealth is created, it's a simple equation. It is wealth that begets wealth. And what I mean by that, it is having capital at a key point in one's life to allow them to get into a vehicle like a home as opposed to renting, or if you're a worker with an innovative idea, the ability to have the capital to start a business, or to finance an education without the albatross of debt and to get into a managerial or professional occupation and benefit from a 401k type employer match program where you're generating wealth. So the key ingredient that I said there was wealth begets wealth. The $1,000 seed is not going to be nearly enough to put a family into a wealth building account. And we know very well might be perhaps even inflationary for asset prices if everybody gets it and you don't have the progressive mechanism. And then also we can understand we haven't redressed benefit cliffs. So if you're a poor individual with $1,000 at 18 years old, you might be disqualified from accessing a housing subsidy, accessing SNAP benefits, or even Medicaid. So you very well could make some people worse off. So here is the mechanism that the Trump accounts have in order to grow the accounts. 529 type tax provisions so that if you save money, you get tax benefits in order to grow the accounts for your child. So you can reserve some of your income towards these Trump accounts in order to, in a tax deferred way, to grow the accounts. The problem with this is most Americans, and particularly low income Americans, don't have resources to save in the first place. We know that, what is the figure that the Fed often puts out? $400 in the bank. I believe that only about 40% of Americans actually have $400 in the bank. Now, if we added a little more of that number, you get a bigger swath of individuals that don't have resources in the bank. So the Trump account approach is essentially going to enhance inequality because it provides a basically another tax shelter for those people that already have resources to save in the first place. So it is an idea that is co-opted both in rhetoric and policy, the baby bonds idea that I've put forth and that Ayanna Presley and Cory Booker have championed. In their version of the bill, they seed every American with $1,000 at birth. I'm sorry, every newborn with $1,000 at birth. And then on an annual basis, they will progressively add to the accounts in a way that is grounded in the income or the wealth of the family in which you're born. So then when you become a young adult, you'll have in a progressive way, not only the $1,000 seed, but enough of a resource to be able to actually purchase a home as opposed to, frankly, be vulnerable to benefit cliffs.
Yeah, no, these are very good points, and it is, it's one of these things. I of course thought of you when I saw them pushing this, thinking, I don't think you're going to be happy with this. Yeah, I mean, $1,000, that's good, that's something, but you just go, okay, look at everything else you're doing. So, again, I'm thinking of families that have one or two kids. They got the $1,000. Let's say working class families, that they're struggling to get by, and that means oftentimes they're out of work, not by choice, but you lose your job, things happen, you have an illness, so they're in and out of work. They have issues, he's taking away their Medicaid, so you're going to have families that, the kid has $1,000 in the account, but they now can't pay for their health care. Some of these people might be facing homelessness.
That's right.
And then, as you say, get to 18 and okay, they have $1,000. It's accumulated some interest. So they have a little more, but that's not going to go very far. I mean, you think of the things, we're saying you're buying a home. Well, you're not going to get home with, let's say it's double 2,000, probably hasn't, but let's say it's double to 2,000. You're not getting home with a $2,000 deposit, or, let's talk about college. They've made the conditions on student loans, much, much more onerous. And that this was, again, one of the things we should have had on our list when we were talking about what was done in the pandemic. They suspended student loan payments, so you had a lot of people that owed money on their student loans, and because of the conditions of the pandemic, they weren't able to pay it. So we suspended that. I'm forgetting exactly. I think some of those are just ending now or ended just recently. But people were able to defer paying on their student loans. I should also mention, and Biden didn't get anywhere near the credit. I'm not going to say it was ideal, but he had a very generous, to my view, income-based student loan repayment plan that would have had a lot of people, we hear the story of someone who gets through college and for whatever reason, they're not able to get a good paying job. They end up working at a barista at a Starbucks, well, that person wouldn't owe anything under Biden's plan. So you had, I think it was $33,000 a year was the cutoff. If you made less than $33,000 a year, you didn't pay anything. And then you paid 5% above that. If you end up getting a high paying job, great. You paid back your student loan. But, it made it so that there was not this big risk. And again, this is very much a family income type thing, because if you come from, a relatively well-off family, you might take the risk, take out 20, 30, 40,000 student debt. And, if you end up and you don't get a good job, your parents could help you pay it off. I know people have been in that situation. Parents help pay them off. That's great. But, if you come from a working class family, lower income family, you don't have parents who could help pay you off. So that sounds like a really big risk. You're going to be very reluctant to take out 20 or 30, 40,000 in student loans to get through college. And, you'll have your $1,000 Trump account, and the school say that's nice, but that gets you through less than half of one semester. So it was. I'm sure you were more pained by it than I was, but I was going, this is not a step forward.
Yeah, but here's some opportunities, right? So I said rhetoric and design. So I talked a lot about design, right? There's the asset limit test that low-income individuals would face, and if that $1,000 seed accumulated some interest, it would disqualify them in a way that would be detrimental for certain other type programs. Then the other big problem with the design issue is the reliance on the tax code in a way that subsidizes those that can already afford to save in a regressive way. Here's the rhetorical problem of the policy, as you pointed out, Dean, which is in the context of this reconciliation bill, this is a populist distraction that's actually going to enhance inequality under the guise of trying to promote the well-being of individuals. They also have stuff in there, again, mean-spirited. You have to have at least one parent with a social security number, or tax ID in order to qualify for it. Well, I don't even know if that's a legal provision. But that is clearly going after his attack on what he's calling birthright citizenship, etc. So that's a rhetorical problem. Again, a distraction from a populist standpoint. And then if you couple it with his other programs where they are trying to demographically engineer a certain demography in America with various other approaches and schemes. While on the one hand, he's trying to promote the fertility of certain types of Americans, but on the other hand, he's trying to rid us of the demography of other types of Americans. Now, that to me is exactly what government shouldn't be doing. And again, he's doing this in a way that's intertwined with both his politics and economics. But to not make this all about Donald Trump and to understand not only what he's doing, the context that got us here, and then here's what we can also talk about way forward, what we can do to actually achieve the outcomes that we desire and that we want. And that, I'd say, is going to be reliant on not only government policies that don't make us vulnerable to strong man type politics, but a new form of solidarity, a new way of thinking about solidarity that expands beyond interest convergence, that expands beyond a class solidarity that says that because you're poor and I'm poor, we need to align. Because why is that problematic? Or why is that not a sustainable solidarity? In my mind, there'll be another context where somebody's relative status might be more beneficial to them in that context, and then the solidarity dissolves. Another problem with that type of solidarity that's based solely on interest convergence is that it's often the non-dominant group that's asked to give up their identity in order to assimilate with the dominant group. And then, Dean, I'll say two last things, then I'll stop, which is, if we're thinking about identity and the humanity of identity, there are at least two things that need to exist. One is nobody in a transactional way should suffer a disadvantage or gain advantage materially or psychologically in a transaction. And what do I mean by that? So if your house is being appraised, it should not be appraised lower simply because you're Black. If you're engaged in just walking down the street, you should not be subject to stop and frisk. So the psychological threat and trauma of impeding your mobility because you're Black should not exist. Those are inhumane. But here's the other aspect that's also inhumane when we think about identity. To ask anybody to disassociate from the group, the identity group to which they belong, to tell somebody you cannot choose and identify in a cultural or aesthetic way the lineage from which you come, or the sexual orientation that you have, or your gender identity in general. That is inhumane to ask somebody to give up that type of identity. So when we're thinking about definitions of solidarity, they need to incorporate notions that bring us together, that do not ask us to give up our humanity in doing so. Not only is that right, it will last for a more sustainable solidarity that's not vulnerable to somebody exploiting the cleavages amongst us in an identity way, in a relative way, for their own personal gain. It's a more long-lasting solidarity. It's a more ethical solidarity. And that is going to be a critical ingredient for us ultimately to generate an economy that centers people as well as the environments in which we live.
Well, I think that's a great place to end on. That is an uplifting note, more uplifting than I've heard for a while. So thanks a lot for joining us here. And I hope I'll have you on again before too long, and we'll have some concrete good news to point to. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Dean. And one more professional attribute I have is I'm now the chief economist of the AFL-CIO.
I knew that. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Yes,
High praise to our great friend Bill Spriggs, who did yeoman-like leadership in this position. So I got huge shoes to fill. And I know you've been so intricate to the labor movement for so long. So gratitude to you as well for creating a pathway to allow me to enter.
Yeah, well, congratulations on getting that. I'm really sorry I didn't mention that because I had heard that. I did know that. I just had forgotten. And yes, Bill Spriggs was a great guy. I forget how long he'd been. Unfortunately, he passed on too young, but he held that position as the chief economist for probably about a decade. And I knew him long before. In fact, when I first came to Washington and worked at the Economic Policy Institute, he was in the next office from me. I bothered him all the time. I had questions about this and that, but he's a great guy. And, again, unfortunately passed on too young. But congratulations. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned your position there.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for coming on. If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.